So today we're going to talk about how all of the changes that we've been viewing, changes in politics, right? We're building these huge, expansive territorial empires, changes in economics. We're talking about mercantilism. We're talking about other new economic ways of being. We're talking about how all of those things work together to serve to concentrate power. And so what we're going to talk about today is how all of that concentration of power, how all of that change, how that actually affected social hierarchies, right? So think about the social hierarchies we talked about in the past. Think about feudalism in Europe. Think about the Confucian social hierarchy. Think about the caste system in India. A lot of this changes because of just how dramatic this unit really is. So to begin, we're going to start talking about China. So we already know that the Qing dynasty is a foreign dynasty. So the Manchu people come in from modern day Manchuria and they establish the Qing dynasty in 1368. No, wrong. 1644, when the last Ming emperor commits suicide. Because they are Manchu, right? Because they are not Chinese, they are the new elite, right? So they are the new social hierarchy, and they replace ethnic Chinese in the royal court, in the advisory council, and in the military commands. They do also be sure to kind of add in elements of Qing language and culture to the Chinese population. And most importantly of that is the queue, the shaved back head with the braided ponytail. And that was something that was unique to Manchu culture. And so they forced that upon Han Chinese men. And they do that really just to flex their power, right? Just as a flex, as a major flex. And it's a sign of submission and conformity. So if the dynasty starts in 1644, by 1645, the Manchu warlord who will become the emperor gives the Han Chinese people 10 days to adopt the queue or face death. And as you can imagine, right, this is people's culture. This is not accepted very well or very easily. And so it's really resisted across China. And it will result in mass executions. Hundreds of thousands of Han Chinese men will be executed for not wearing the queue hairstyle, right? So when you think about how the social hierarchy has changed and how you flex on people that you conquer, this is definitely a way to do it. They don't, however, impose all of their cultural traits on the Han. So some they reserve to kind of keep themselves separate and special. One of these things is called the 8 banners system. So the 8 banner system is basically a military organization, and it's the emperor's way of asserting control and defending his borders. It creates a political and a social structure which places Manchu families under one of these 8 different colored banners. It helps to give them kind of an increased elite status and also to separate them out from the non-Manchu Han Chinese. Let's move across Asia to the Ottoman Empire. So we've done a lot of talking about the Janissary system and the devshirme, right? The devshirme is kind of your number one way of a changing social elite, right? You take these Christian peasant boys from backwoods nowhere in the Balkans, and you give them the opportunity to rise up in the social status as a Janissary or as a bureaucrat. That's one way. Another way that the Ottoman Empire treats people differently is through the millet system. So that's M-I-L-L-E-T. Under the millet system, each unique religious group was, they were treated under their own laws. So for Christians, they were treated under canon law, and for the Jewish population, they were treated under halakha. They did pay higher taxes, we know that, right? They had to pay the jizya, which included the blood tax paid in the devshirme, which, like, a tax paid through sons, which is awkward. But that's kind of how they were able to differentiate. In theory, there were a lot of other differences that were supposed to be accounted for in the different religious groups. So, for example, non-Muslims were supposed to be barred from holding high office, but that really wasn't well enforced. And theoretically, only Muslims could hold government jobs, but that really wasn't well enforced either. And to hold a government job, you could also just be a convert. So you could convert to Islam from Christianity or Judaism. Another really interesting thing in terms of social hierarchy for the Ottoman Empire is that it didn't matter if you were free or enslaved, you could still rise to positions of power, right? It really was based on merit in that case. So another thing we have to talk about with the Ottoman Empire is the changing status of women. So the most powerful women in the Ottoman Empire were women of the harem, which was women who were wives, concubines, and servants of the Ottoman court, particularly the Ottoman Sultan. They were governed by one very, very powerful woman that often was the Sultan's favorite wife or concubine, or even his mother. And the women within the harem could exert a lot of control over the Sultan or the Sultan's officials, because often if they weren't one of the Sultan's wives, if they were just a concubine, then they could be married off to his officials. So that connection between the Sultan and the official would be maintained through his wife, through the wife who came from the harem. So that way, that like the power that a woman could control was there. So another way that a woman could gain power was by promoting the needs and interests of her son. So if she was a wife of the Sultan, she could, right, kind of position herself and her son in a position to where her son would hopefully become the next sultan. This did make things a little unstable though, because a lot of sultans had to worry about whether or not their wives were trying to get rid of them once they had a son, so that the son could become the sultan in place of the father, and the father could go bye-bye. But I mean, that was a concern, right? And it's a concern to have, but it did result in, right, more positions of power for women. Speaking of the separate groups in the Ottoman Empire as well, there is a huge influx of Jews into the Ottoman Empire after 1492. So we typically think of 1492 as the year that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but it's a big deal in other ways as well. So it's the year that Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain are able to finally finish their Reconquista, where they reconquer all of the Muslim lands in southern Spain and what is today Andalusia. And when they do that, they institute an order in which they banish all the Jews from Spain. And so they have to leave because they could convert to Christianity, and sometimes they would still be punished by the Inquisition, or they could leave. They could uproot their entire lives. A lot of them were very prosperous merchants, important scholars, etc. And the place that wanted them was the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire takes in a huge population of Jews at this time, and they are given special privileges within the empire. The empire wants to kind of bolster its merchant class. The Jews are there to help them do that. They do make them live in a certain quarter of the city, just like kind of Christians had to live in a certain quarter of the city. But relative to, you know, being kicked out of Spain, it's a welcome place to go. So that leads us into Europe. So in Europe, we've talked about the growth of the absolute monarchy. In some places that's checked, right? So in England, it's checked by Parliament, but in other places like France, it's not checked at all. And one of the ways that an absolute monarch wants to solidify his power is by decreasing the power of the nobles, right? Those are his biggest rivals, the landed aristocracy. And what's interesting about this period of time is that with the rise in mercantilism and just really kind of commercial capitalism or mercantile capitalism as a whole, we see a growth in a whole new middle class in Europe at this time. So we see a merchant middle class arise of people who are craftsmen and tradesmen and who are building up commercial enterprises. And these people, who in French are called the bourgeoisie, they start to amass huge amounts of wealth. A lot of that is because they're getting really favorable treatment from European monarchs, because these European monarchs see every investment that they make in this merchant middle class as power and money that's getting taken from the nobles. So through tax benefits, through charter companies, through land grants in the Americas, the power of the nobles is being chipped away, and the power of the bourgeoisie, who end up being the taxpayers, starts to increase. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is what new social hierarchy is created in the Americas because of the arrival of Europeans. And this is probably the place where the change is really the most dramatic. So, as Europeans move to the Americas, the majority of the Europeans who move to the Americas are men, right? So, think about in Spain, right? They are the conquistadors. They are people who are going over there. They aren't bringing their families, or they don't have families. They're single men. They're traveling across the Atlantic into the unknown. This is not a family man thing to do. So, these single men go to the Americas. They often have families with Native women, sometimes willingly and sometimes not willingly. Sometimes that's a way for the Spanish to kind of increase their status among the Native people, is to take wives from elite Native families, or sometimes, right, it just happens. So because in the Americas we get this new kind of group of mixed race people, in the Americas, the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, is based on blood. It's based on race. It's based on skin tone, which is very awkward for us to think about now today, right? It's kind of icky and gross. So at the highest level of the what we call the casta system in New Spain, particularly, are people called the peninsulares. They are people from the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, or Spain or Portugal. Under them are people of pure Iberian European blood who were born in the Americas. They are called Creoles or Criollos. Under them come all the different shades of mixed race people. And I don't mean that necessarily in terms of like a skin tone way, but also they kind of meant it in a skin tone way. But all the different, like, these are people who categorized every single combination of people that could exist. And then they also painted them and sent them back to Spain to show the Europeans what was going on in the Americas. And so this racial hierarchy exists with people born in Spain at the top, people of Spanish blood born in the Americas next in line, mixed race people in the middle, and then at the bottom are the indigenous people and imported African slaves. As we look at these images of the casta system, this whole genre of art called casta paintings, it's important to note that as we go through the different like versions of the painting, as people get less and less pure Spanish blooded, I guess we could say, that the scenes get more and more chaotic. And I think that really shows the racial attitudes that were arising in Europe and how Europeans viewed the kind of craziness that was happening in the Americas, and how little relation that there starts to be culturally between people of Europe and people of European descent in the Americas. So there's a lot of change that goes on in this era, economically, politically, and socially. And I think that the social changes that we've talked about here really illustrate how interconnected the politics, the religion, and the economics are for this unit.